broad category that won't be as complex as those, with as many branches as those, but it's going to take us a couple of weeks just to walk through it. And this topic will be the subject of marriage. We want to develop a biblical marriage ethic. It's important to recognize the definition there, biblical, because we live in a culture that is constantly redefining marriage. So you have the laws passed in, 2015, that have technically made same-sex marriage legal in all 50 states. So we've been dealing with for a few decades now this battle for same-sex marriage to be part of the definition of marriage in our nation. You also have an increase in cohabitation, and this element where some places around the globe recognize common law marriage based on cohabitation. Do you realize that in our country alone, statistics are constantly rising on cohabitation? So according to Pew Research Center in 2019, so we're talking 6 years ago, 59% of adults ages 18 to 44 have lived with an unmarried partner at some point in their lives. And then research conducted by Bowling Green State University's National Center for Family and Marriage Research published in 2021 that 3/4 of marriages from 2015 to 2019 were preceded by cohabitation. So that element is on the rise constantly as well. So we have these factors culturally that are constantly trying to redefine marriage. Our role as disciples, as children of God, is to stand where God stands. We need to recognize this. When it comes to marriage, marriage is not a cultural institution. Marriage is not a governmental institution. You may have to get a license from a government entity for it to be legally recognized, but it's not a government institution. Marriage is first and foremost and will always be God's institution because it was created by Him, originated by Him, defined by Him. It's God's institution. It goes back to the very beginning of the Bible, as you're quite aware, going back all the way to Genesis chapter 1 and chapter 2. So if we want to have the correct biblical ethic on marriage, we have to go to the source, the originator, the author, who is God. And so tonight and really next week, I want to take you through I think I've got 6 different standards related to marriage based on God's design of it that need to be the framework of our understanding or our application and theology, so to speak, of marriage. So I'm going to start with this one. God designed marriage for one man and one woman. Now, the audience to who I am speaking right now really understands this. But we have to reiterate it. We have to bring it up because we do live in a culture that has redefined what is allowed in marriage. So now when we talk about God's design for marriage, we have to specifically acknowledge that He designed it for a heterosexual relationship. And here's how we know that. When Jesus addressed the Pharisees, had a conversation with them about marriage and divorce. Mark's account is in Mark chapter 10. They are questioning Him specifically on what is acceptable terms of divorce. But Jesus, instead of entering into the debate that they're trying to create, responds by focusing on what God's ideal is. And so you can see them asking, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? But by the time he's giving his response, you get to verse 6. And here's what he really says. But from the beginning of creation. So he's saying the original design, it all goes back to the beginning. Here's what God intended. God made them male and female. Now, he's quoting directly from Genesis chapter 1 when he says that, from verse 27 of Genesis chapter 1. And that, if you go back to Genesis chapter 1, which we're going to do real quick, it's not really a passage about marriage. Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27 is really talking about God's creation of mankind. But what Jesus does here in Mark chapter 10 is he links God's creation of mankind with God's institution of marriage. God made them male and female. Verse 7, therefore a man, gender specific, shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife. Gender specific. What Jesus does is he takes Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 and Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 and meshes them together, combines them together, and thereby indicates God's intentionality of creating two opposite genders and creating the marital relationship for them. God's creation, or let me rephrase that, by referencing the gender specificity of marriage as male and female, Jesus identified the circumstances under which two individuals could enter into marriage. So Jesus appeals back to God's creation to say, hey, here's the first definition of marriage, the first parameter, the first defining trait of marriage: one man, one woman. But it's also important for us to recognize that not only does Jesus say this and therefore it's binding, but let's also go back to the creative account. In Genesis chapter 1 and verse 28, verse 27 is where we're told that God made them male and female. But look at verse 28. Now this does have a marital application to it. In verse 28, after creating them male and female, we're told that God blessed them. And God said to them, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it. What's so very fascinating is that the very first command given to man in the Bible is a reproductive command. And a reproductive command then is part of the framework of marriage. And a reproductive command can only be fulfilled in a heterosexual relationship. So when we go back to the creation account, not only do we have God's creation of male and female, God's institution of marriage, but we have His command, His expectation of what a marital relationship can accomplish. And the first command for both humans and honestly for animals as well was to procreate. A process that can only be fulfilled through the sexual relationship of a man and a woman. But we also need to notice what happens in Genesis chapter 2. When God noticed that Adam, the first man, was alone, He said, it is not good the man should be alone. Don't miss the significance of God's statement here. The entirety of Genesis chapter 1, the order of creation, everything is being identified as good. Day 1, good. Day 2, good. Day 3, good. Everything God creates was good. This was the first thing that God said was not good. And it was mankind's loneliness. And so God sees Adam all by himself and says, that's not good. I will make him a helper fit for him. What follows then is a parade of every animal on the earth before Adam, and he's given the assignment to name them. On a side note, I'd love to know the names he actually picked. Because he wasn't speaking English, and I don't think he was speaking Latin. So I'd love to know what he named them. Anyway, that's a side note. But God didn't just have them present themselves to Adam for naming. God's also having them present themselves to Adam for Adam to realize there is no complement to him in all of creation. Every animal comes by Adam, and Adam's going to very clearly see that That's not a match for me. That's not a match for me. And it's after this parade of animals that God causes a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And while he slept, God took one of his ribs and closed up its place with flesh. And the rib that the Lord God had taken from the man, he made into a woman and brought her to the man. Wouldn't you love to know Adam's first reaction when he sees that Eve? Wouldn't you love to know how he responded when he opened his eyes and saw that figure standing before him, and all of a sudden he goes, that's my match. She's exactly like me, with some differences. With differences that he saw in all the other animals of creation. Because at that stage, all the other animals had mates of the opposite sex for them to be able to procreate as God commanded them to do. And now Adam is looking and he's seeing his match, his complement. And now he knows that this is what? Bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. He gets it now. See, God used this situation of parading the animals before Adam, then putting him to sleep and waking him up to the presence of this woman for him to understand that she's the helper fit for him, to understand that she's the complement to him. So when we go back to the creation account, God's design of marriage, whether we're talking about how he created two genders, how he displayed to Adam the difference between him and all the other animals, allowed him to see that all the other animals had pairs, and now he has a pair by creating Eve. In the fact that he commanded, the first command he gave was a command of procreation. All of this is emphasizing heterosexuality in marriage to the exclusion of homosexuality. So regardless of how our culture or our government may define marriage, we must defend, promote, and adhere to God's definition of marriage being between one man and one woman. Now, I get it. There's really not anything that we've covered so far that you didn't already know. But when we're dealing with ethics, we always have to start with even the simplest of things. We don't need to assume everybody's heard it. We need to lay the entire foundation of biblical teaching on any ethical subject, because it's going to guide how we handle the difficult or the controversial situations that come along. So the first thing we want to acknowledge, the first thing we want to really emphasize is that God designed marriage for one man and one woman. Now, I don't want to go too far from this statement. I do want to take the time to emphasize that God made marriage for one man and one woman. We kind of alluded to the issue of polygamy in a previous study in this class, but didn't spend much time on it. It's actually kind of one of those arenas that we don't feel like we have to address too much. There's not, in our country, too many people we are ever going to come in contact with that are in a polygamous marriage. Now, in other cultures, in other belief systems, it does still take place. So, we need to acknowledge what the Bible has to say on this side of the one man, one woman equation as well. Now, let me acknowledge right off the bat that nowhere in the Bible did God ever command polygamy. There's nowhere in the Bible where he told anyone to marry more than one wife. There's nowhere in the Bible that he gave any explicit moral approval of polygamy. But we also have to acknowledge that in the Old Testament specifically, God didn't really give any explicit prohibitions against it. The only statement I'm aware of in the Old Testament that is anti-polygamy is found in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, but I want to give you the whole context of what is being said. It's very interesting because this is Mosaic law. This is being told to Israel through Moses prior to the conquest of the land of Canaan. And yet, God in these verses is going to give some rules for when they have appointed a king. And it's so fascinating because it's years, decades later that they're even going to request a king. And God's going to be heartbroken that they requested a king. But guess what? God, in his infinite wisdom, had already set some policies in place for the day that they asked for a king. And this is the instructions. Beginning in verse 14, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me, like all the nations that are around me. God even is forecasting their motivation here. Verse 15, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. You may not put a foreigner over you, who is not your brother. Only he must not acquire many horses for himself. Why do you think that is? There's an element in here where God is wanting to ensure that the king doesn't take the position that, hey, I'm great because of what I acquired. He wants the humility and recognition of God's provisions to be kept in place. So they can't acquire many horses or cause the people to return to Egypt in order to acquire many horses, since the Lord has said to you, you shall never return that way again. But now notice verse 17. And he, a reference to this future king, shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. Now the excessive silver and gold certainly is there to protect against greed and self-sufficiency, things of that nature. But notice that God gives a specific reason for not acquiring many wives. And that is so that they don't have a negative spiritual influence on the king. Now, it's fascinating because both David and Solomon are totally going to break this rule. And yet they receive no direct biblically recorded condemnation for it. And notice that this policy is not stated in the context of the general public. It's specifically addressed to kings. So how do we deal with this? How do we respond to, or how do we handle knowing that in the Old Testament, people did have multiple wives? Well, I like the way this author said it. We must concede that God temporarily allowed polygamy to occur without giving explicit commands against it, even though it did not conform to his original purpose for marriage as indicated in Genesis chapter 1 through 2. Now, that can feel uncomfortable to say in those words, that God temporarily allowed polygamy to occur. God's allowance of certain things is not the same as God causing those things. But we also need to recognize, as this author goes on to say, that in every narrative that mentions multiple wives, there's always a hint of trouble. But we get some hints from the narrative passages, this author says, that polygamy was not in line with God's purposes because in every example where a man has more than one wife, the situation leads to significant difficulty in the marriage relationship, and readers are left to draw their own conclusions from this fact. So think about some of the polygamous relationships in the Old Testament. The very first one is a guy named Lamech, has 2 wives, and Lamech is notorious for being the guy that killed more than Cain did. He is a horrible figure in the Old Testament. And he only appears in a few verses, but he is looked down upon significantly. You can move forward and you can think about Jacob. Jacob ends up with 2 wives. Wasn't necessarily his intent to have 2 wives. Part of the process of his father-in-law deceiving him, he ends up with Leah and Rachel. not criticized or condemned for having two wives, but Jacob's life was kind of difficult because of the multi-marriage situation. There was jealousy from Leah toward Rachel because Rachel was loved more. There was jealousy from Rachel toward Leah because Leah was able to have children and she wasn't. And it was just this complicated mess. I mean, you just read the story of Jacob and his wives, and it'll make you never want to have more than one wife. But you can continue on and looking at Solomon especially and how his multiple wives led him away from the Lord. So we do see this connection in all the instances of multiple wives. And David had his fair share of complications with multiple wives. I'm not trying to overlook him. But in every scenario where you read about multiple wives, it's a complicated life. Now, but why didn't God just outright condemn it? Well, Wayne Jackson, the author of the Christian Courier, explained theologically why that might be the case. He said, many evils were overlooked in those days in the sense that the deserved punishment was not extracted during a time when the divine revelation was more rudimentary than it was under the New Testament economy. It was a time of moral ignorance. Now, he makes reference to 3 verses here in the New Testament that kind of make his point for him. Those 3 verses are these. Ooh, no. I lost the verses, didn't I? Nope, there they are. Matthew chapter 19 and verse 8. Jesus, in that same conversation with the Pharisees about marriage and divorce, in reference to divorce, says, because of your hardness of heart, Moses allowed you to divorce your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. In context, what Jesus is saying is, from the beginning of creation, God did not intend for divorce to exist, but he allowed it under Moses because of your hardness of hearts. Think about that in terms of polygamy. It wasn't what God intended. God intended one man, one woman, but you could say the same thing. He allowed it for a reason. Not his, but a mankind reason, you could say. You can all... Oh, that's never good. You could also look at Acts chapter 14 and verse 16, where Paul is in Lystra, and he's preaching there, and he makes this statement in verse 16. He said, in past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own way. Another reference to God allowing something to exist without necessarily punishing it, even though it was against his will. And then there's also Acts chapter 17 and verse 30, where at the Areopagus in Athens, Paul will say the times of ignorance God overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent. There was a period where God allowed certain things to happen, but now he expects differently. That's the point that Wayne Jackson is trying to make in the article he published on polygamy. And you can read the rest of that article on the Christian Courier website. But I think he makes a strong theological case for why we should view this as something that God allowed. Now, while that should suffice for us, it's worth pointing out that other scholars contend that there was a practical reason for not outright condemning polygamy. I got my slides out of order, that's right. There we go. As one author says, the reason polygamy seems to have been allowed may have something to do with the provision of an economic safety net for women. Remember that in the ancient world, there were very few working women, at least not working in a reputable occupation. For the most part, women were provided for either by their family of origin or by marriage. Women who never married or who were widowed were not generally seen as able to financially provide for themselves, though there were some exceptions. And then he goes on to appeal to the levirate marriage law that we recently studied or talked about in our Sunday morning series on Ruth, where if a woman is widowed and childless, a relative of her deceased husband was to take her in and have a child with her to become the heir of the deceased husband. So, in a levirate marriage policy, technically, the relative that is taking her in may already be married. Anyway, the point is, some think there may have been an economic reason for God allowing this, a social justice reason for God allowing this to protect the welfare of women who in that culture may have been in poverty otherwise. Now, I'm not saying I agree with this. This is a theory. We don't have necessarily we can't go to the Bible and say, yep, this is the reason. This is what some scholars have reasoned could be the potential answer to the question of why God allowed polygamy. Regardless of God's reason, all we can say is that He allowed it then. But we have to conclude that when Jesus came to fulfill the law and prophets, as Matthew chapter 5 and verse 17 tells us, He affirmed the initial God-given design for monogamy by appealing to the creation account when He said, from the beginning, God made them male and female. Jesus, the Son of God, declares in the New Testament that this is how it was intended to be, and this is the way it must be going forward. He established an enduring ethical standard for marriage, and there is no indication in the New Testament that polygamy was allowed or even tolerated in the church. In fact, one of the qualifications of church leaders eliminates the possibility of polygamy. It's funny, when we hear the husband of one wife in reference to elders, shepherds, overseers, we're always thinking about remarriage. Well, underlying that very qualification is the exclusion of anyone in polygamous relationships. And there were some in Judaism of the first century who were still practicing polygamy. So they're automatically, even if they become Christians, they're automatically excluded from a role such as this. Now listen, I know that's about elders, shepherds, overseers. That's not written to the general audience of Christians, but let's consider the fact that if this expectation is placed upon those that we are to follow, those that are supposed to shepherd us, those that we are called as disciples to obey and submit to, then doesn't that indicate that God has a high expectation of marriage? And based on the teachings of the New Testament, it completely eliminates the possibility of polygamy. So God designed marriage to be between one man and one woman. That doesn't just address same-sex marriage, that also addresses the possibility of polygamous marriage. So now that we got those two out of the way, let's see if we can get a couple more before our time is up. I think the third statement we need to acknowledge is that God designed marriage to be the primary human relationship between those who enter into it. I want you to think about this. The first relationship in all of creation was a marital relationship. Not a parent-child relationship, a marital relationship. God chose to initiate human relations through marriage. That should give us some indication of the primacy He places on it. Now you could say, well, you have to because of procreation. Well, He could have started with a parent and a child. Parents and a child. He could have started with an entire family, but He started with a couple. I think that's significant. But that's not really the basis for understanding the primacy of marriage in human relationships. That is evidenced particularly by Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, where the instruction is given that a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife. Now, I want you to think about Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24. This is not something said by Adam. This is not something said by Eve. This is not even technically something said directly by God in the narrative. This is a statement written by the inspiration of God by whoever authored Genesis. It's a narrative comment in the text of the Scripture. And I want you to think for a moment. Did Adam have a father and mother at this point? No. Did Eve have a family of origin? No. Then why is this statement here? I think it's because God wanted future generations to understand that when you enter into a husband and wife relationship like Adam and Eve did, the expectation is that your relationship with your spouse will have precedence over every other relationship you possess. The leave and cleave principle, that King James version of this terminology here, the leave and cleave principle instructs man and woman to initiate their own household as one flesh. Their relationship becomes the primary human relationship that they possess. Now, God's emphasis on the marital relationship, it means that a husband or wife, as a husband or wife, your relationship with your spouse must not be neglected in favor of a relationship with anyone else. When we favor a relationship with someone other than our spouse, we plant the seeds for distrust, conflict, and future consequences. It becomes a foothold for the devil, so to speak. And so what that means is that your relationship with your spouse must be more important than your relationship with your buddies or your girlfriends. Buddies for men, girlfriends for girls, not the other way around. It means that your relationship with your spouse must be important than your relationship with your own parents. And it means that your relationship with your spouse must be more important than your relationship with your kids. And I got to be honest, that last one's the one that I struggle with the most. That's where I can fail, by prioritizing Micah and Leah over Sarah at times. I try to make a point this week, kind of silly, to Micah in particular, that Sarah gets precedence. Because my birthday was a couple weeks ago and I wasn't here, the staff took me out to lunch. And I get to pick where I go, and I chose Cheesecake Factory. Of course, why not, But the problem is, I'm also trying to lose weight. Now, what I eat there as a main course, not bad. Cheesecake, bad. So, I made a decision. I had a free slice of cheesecake for my birthday, emailed to me from Cheesecake Factory. So I decided not to get the cheesecake for myself. So on Monday night, we're going on Tuesday for lunch. On Monday night, I'm standing in the kitchen, and I asked Sarah what flavor cheesecake she'd want. And she told me, and Micah looked at me, and she just had she was like, "You're going to get her a cheesecake and not me?" And I simply said, "My wife gets priority over you." She didn't like that answer. And granted, that's not something that I've successfully done or said many times before, but I did want in that moment, I kind of wanted Micah to hear that. I kind of wanted myself to hear it, because that's reality. Now, this is important, because if we get this right, do you understand it can prevent many marital conflicts, number one. It can even prevent divorce, which I know that's where everybody's ready for me to go, but that's probably going to be, that's definitely going to be next week, if not even the week after that. But we will get there. Phil, I thought you were clapping for a second. He's just relaxing and paying attention, but he's putting his hands together, and I mentioned divorce, and he's doing this. It just like he's clapping. He wasn't, though, Phil. I'm sorry. I may have just embarrassed you, and I apologize for that. But here's what I want you to understand. You should not neglect your other relationships, whether it be your friends or your parents or your siblings or your children. You don't neglect those, but you should protect the relationship with your spouse. I want you to notice something Paul said, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 32 through 35 in particular. He says this, "I want you to be free from anxieties. The unmarried man is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to please the Lord. But the married man is anxious about worldly things, how to please his wife, and his interests are divided. And the unmarried or betrothed woman is anxious about the things of the Lord, how to be holy in body and spirit. But the married woman is anxious about worldly things, how to please her husband. I say this for your own benefit, not to lay any restraint upon you, but to promote good order and to secure your undivided devotion to the Lord. Do you understand what Paul's saying here? He's saying that when you are single, you can give your complete devotion to God. But when you are married, you cannot. Once you enter into the covenant of marriage, your spouse deserves and requires a portion of your attention. And I want you to pay close attention to the fact that nowhere does Paul criticize or condemn a spouse from having divided interests, from having divided focus, from giving some of that attention to their husband or wife. There's no condemnation of that in this passage. Do you realize what that means? That means a marital relationship is the only relationship that God is okay with taking some attention away from Him. Your marriage is that important to God that He's not upset with you as a married man or a married woman being anxious about how to please your husband or your wife. If that doesn't speak to the primacy of marriage, I don't know what does. So when we look at 1 Corinthians chapter 7 and we tack on the leave and cleave principle from Genesis chapter 2, what we uncover is this expectation that once I enter into marriage, I have to make that my primary human relationship. And I say human relationship because marriage does not supplant your relationship with the Lord. But when it comes to your relationships with other people, your horizontal relationships, this one has to come first. The vertical comes before that. But of the horizontal relationships, this one takes priority. So at this point, we've seen that when we develop an ethic of marriage, it's one man and one woman. It's a heterosexual institution. We've seen that it is one man and one woman. It's a monogamous institution. And now we see that it is the primary human relationship. That means it's the primary human institution. We have a few more. Let me see here what time we have. Okay, I got time to do one more. I'm going to do one more foundational principle of a marriage ethic this week. We'll focus on the last ones next week, or the last two on my list for next week, as they will be spelled out in greater detail. But the last one is pretty much already addressed in here, but we have to acknowledge it. That God designed marriage to be the only arena for sexual intimacy. I'm not going to say anything you really haven't already heard in the previous 3 or 4 weeks, but we do need to acknowledge this fact. Because in Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24, we're told that a man shall leave his father and mother, hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. So after initiating the first marriage, God indicated that it was within this relationship that a sexual relationship was permitted. That's really what the concept of one flesh is primarily referring to. God intentionally used the word flesh here to connote the physical aspect of a married couple's relationship. If he wanted to downplay the physical relationship, then he could have used the Hebrew word for soul or spirit or something like that, but he intentionally chose the word flesh, which is a reference to the physical relationship. And since the one flesh concept is linked with the leaving and cleaving principles for marriage, we can conclude that God intends for sex to exist within the bounds of marriage. Again, we've already covered this, but I do want to emphasize it one last time. I want to highlight it one last time. We can see the connection between the one flesh terminology and a sexual relationship when we get to the New Testament, 1 Corinthians chapter 6 and verse 16, where Paul is talking about sexual morality, sexual purity and the such. And he says, do you not know that he who is joined to a prostitute becomes one body with her? For as it is written, the two will become one flesh. Paul is here using the two shall become one flesh terminology to refer to a bodily, physical encounter with a prostitute. So he's saying sex is the arrangement that the one flesh dynamic primarily is fulfilled. So Paul condemned such activity with someone other than one's spouse in this passage because it's infringing on the one flesh dynamic that God specifically created for marriage back in Genesis chapter 2. And this is just the beginning of what Paul has to say about the subject, because just a few verses later, in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we find Paul addressing the importance of the sexual relationship in the context of marriage. Here, beginning in verse 2, he says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. When we look at this particular passage, Paul's instructions regarding physical intimacy indicate that it is limited to the marital relationship, but Paul takes it a step further and indicates that it is an expectation of the marital relationship. It's an expectation because it serves a preventative function against sexual immorality. So Paul's overarching point is that if you need such physical fulfillment, then you need to get married, because it's the only relationship in which you're permitted by God to engage in such an intimate experience. And if you're married, you need to have a sexual relationship. Notice that emphasis on not depriving one another. Paul is saying, hey, the only time you should intentionally go without sex is when you have a spiritual objective related to fasting and praying, when there's a spiritual purpose to it. But other than that, don't deprive each other. Here's the point. Marriage is unique because it's the only relationship in which this type of intimacy is authorized by God. And that's why the author of Hebrews said in Hebrews chapter 13 and verse 4, let marriage bed is in a different translation. Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled. For God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous. I find this verse interesting for the fact that there's a distinction between the sexually immoral and adultery. And what God is communicating through this passage is honor the sexual relationship in marriage, so that not only adultery, but any form of sexual immorality doesn't come in. We spent some time a couple of weeks ago distinguishing sexual immorality and trying to define that. And this is a passage that's saying, hey, your marriage needs to be protected not just from someone having an affair with another person. It needs to be protected from all forms of sexual immorality. Because God's going to judge all forms of sexual immorality. So when we look at the ethic for marriage, we need to emphasize and highlight the sexual relationship, not just as the only place that it's allowed to occur, but also the expectation that it's supposed to occur. And it's supposed to be protective for the people in the marriage. And you're supposed to so care about the sexual relationship in the marriage that you're not allowing these other sexually immoral activities to creep in. So that would be our fourth foundation of a biblical ethic: a monogamous institution, a heterosexual institution, a primary institution, and a sexual institution. We've got two more elements that we will bring up, but I'm going to save those for next week because we're down to our last 10 minutes. Now, nobody's asked me any questions yet, and that's wonderful, but I'm certain somebody wants to bring up something. I will say divorce will be the primary subject going into next week. So if you have questions related to divorce, you can send them to me, but we'll address them next week in particular. And as I have mentioned before, we've already received some divorce-related questions, actually one divorce-related question multiple times, and it will be addressed next week. And that is the question about the passage in Matthew where lust is equated to adultery. Therefore, does that mean lust is a basis for divorce and remarriage based on the passage that precedes it in Matthew or that follows it in Matthew chapter 5? We'll be addressing that next week in our study of divorce, along with at least one other parameter for a biblical marriage ethic. Tonight, do you have any other comments, observations, questions, debates, arguments, ridicules, anything? Brian. I didn't spend time looking at all the polygamous possibilities in Scripture, so I would have to go back and look at that one specifically. But great question. I'll look into it and get back to you. Stan. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point. Ephesians 5 will play a big part into one of the points we'll make next week. But the observation in Ephesians chapter 5 that there's a comparison being made between Jesus' relationship with the church and then a husband's relationship with his wife, I think that speaks to the primacy because there's no bigger or more important relationship than Jesus and his church because it's a saving relationship based on his love of her. And so the fact that the salvific relationship in the Bible is the basis for comparison to marriage tells us just how important marriage is to God. God doesn't just throw around marriage as a metaphor for anything. It's always a metaphor for his relationship with his people. And so God created marriage to be a means for us to understand what our relationship with him ought to be. So that definitely speaks to the primacy of the husband-wife relationship above all others. We tend to focus on God the Father and us as children more than we do God the husband and us the bride, even though that metaphor is present all throughout Scripture. And in the Old Testament, it is significantly used, the marital relationship of marital metaphor is used. So when you consider Ephesians 5, which we're going to spend some time in next week, and you're looking at how husbands are called to love their wives, and you see it's a complete theological comparison to how Christ loved the church, what you're seeing is how important that relationship ought to be because it's compared to the most important relationship there is. So thank you for making that observation. Any other comments, Michael? No, because that would fall under two categories. It could fall under the polygamous marriage relationship, and this is a question about handmaids and concubines. That could fall under polygamy, but it's definitely going to fall under sexual immorality. So either way you look at it, whether you're considering it in the polygamous environment or the sexually immoral environment, it's already addressed by these other things we've studied previously or are studying tonight. So, plus, I'm not sure that in the U.S. there's anybody that has concubines. I could be proven wrong. But culturally, okay, going in the surrogacy route. Well, that is going to be addressed in another study. I'm saving that for the medical ethics study. But that's a great point. Surrogacy is a whole other ball game. Yeah. Hopefully a ball game I can pass on to somebody else. Michael.
Adam and Eve never registered their marriage with a government. Do you think that you could be married in God's eyes but not legally recognized by a government?
Well, the one thing I want to throw out there is that in addition to God's ethical standards on marriage, he has ethical standards about obedience to government. So I think that plays a part. Particularly, I don't think you could, let's just use the United States as the standard. I don't think you could justify being married in the eyes of God, but not in the eyes of the state, because we are called to submit to the governing authorities. However, you get stranded on a desert island somewhere that nobody can find. I mean, we can get into those hypotheticals, but I'm not going there. But I think you got to add that submission to the governing authorities into the equation. If the government has nothing to do with marriage, well, maybe there's a different story. But great question. All right, let me let Bradley go, and then we'll be wrapping up very soon. Bradley?
I was just going to comment about his question.
Okay.
When I got married, the preacher that married me and Denise was in a bad accident, and his wife was in the burn center in Birmingham, Alabama. Well, he was a young man then when he married us, in his probably late 20s, but he didn't record the marriage certificate.
Mm.
And I only found that out 20 years later, after me and her had been married. That I was reading a newspaper of a guy upstate New York that had they didn't record his marriage certificate. So he worked for the government and had a very, very good job. But come to find out, they wouldn't let her have his benefits, his retirement after he passed away, because that certificate never was, even though they lived together, was together for all those
Yeah.
years. She tried to find it, but it didn't happen. So it just brought my attention to, where's our marriage certificate at?
Yeah.
Because I work for the government.
Yeah.
She said, well, I don't know. Well, I go down to the courthouse and try to find it. That's when I found out that he never had recorded. So there
Wow.
are things by
Yeah. But that's not your fault.
the law of the land that could cause you issues
Yeah.
as far as your retirement,
Yeah.
your legality about it.
I'll add this in there whenever I am asked to officiate the ceremonies of people. First question I have for them when I arrive is, did you bring the marriage license? Because what I do is I ask for the marriage license so I can sign it, and then I ask permission to be the one to take it to the courthouse. And I've been known on a Monday to get up and drive to Dawsonville or wherever I got to go to file that in the proper location, because I want to make sure that thing gets in there. That's just personal. It's my signature. I'm the one responsible, so I want to be the one to make sure it goes to the proper place. And I'm not a fan of mailing it. I have mailed them out of necessity, but my preference is to walk into a courthouse and hand it to somebody because I want it to be legal from the moment forward. Wow.
Let me share something with you. In the Latin American countries, there's poverty, and a couple wants to get married, doesn't have the money to get the license that's required by the government. So most of them don't go that route. And we've had petition campaigns in the countries that want to pay. They use kind of do the help when they find out that they don't have a legal marriage.
All right. Well, I thank you for your attendance this evening and your participation in the study. Hope you'll return next week as we continue our study. Don't move. I'm doing some attendance work here, and this is one way where I can help myself. If you ever attended my ladies' Bible class on Wednesday mornings, you know exactly about this. All right. Thank you, and you are dismissed.